Peter Pan returned to Neverland. Once upon a time, a girl named Wendy met a magical boy named Peter Pan. He took her to a wondrous place called Neverland where no one ever grows up. When Wendy returned home, she promised, "I'll always believe in you, Peter Pan." Years passed. Wendy grew up, but she never forgot her promise. Every night, Wendy told her 2 children stories about Peter Pan, the Lost Boys, and a tiny fairy named Tinkerbell. Wendy's daughter, a serious 12-year-old named Jane, had no use for make-believe. But her brother, Danny, loved hearing the stories again and again, especially the one about Captain Hook and the treasure. Excuse me. Captain Hook and his men stole treasure from other ships. They kept their loot on their ship, the Jolly Roger. One night, Peter Pan and the Lost Boys slipped aboard the Jolly Roger and stole Hook's treasure. It was all just a great game for Peter. Peter and Hook had a long, fierce sword fight. Eventually, Peter and the boys escaped with the treasure. Then, Tinkerbell showered the pirate ship with pixie dust, which made the Jolly Roger float off into the sky. "You've not seen the end of me, Peter Pan. I'll get you for this if it's the last thing I do," Captain Hook shouted as he drifted away. "Hook will never win as long as there is faith, trust, and pixie dust," Wendy said as she ended her story for the night. Danny was delighted, but not Jane. She thought it was all just childish nonsense. "Peter Pan isn't real, and people don't fly." "They do too," cried Danny. "Oh, Daniel, grow up," Jane said and went to her room. Jane lay down on a seat next to the window. After a while, she fell asleep. While she slept, something strange happened in the sky outside. A surprise visitor appeared. It was someone she never, ever expected to see. Jane awoke to see Captain Hook standing next to her. "Hello, Wendy," Hook said wickedly, thinking Jane was her mother. Before Jane could explain, Captain Hook ordered his first mate, Mr. Smee, to put her into a big sack. "My apologies, miss," Smee said as he tied the sack. Hook and Smee took Jane aboard the Jolly Roger and headed back to Neverland. Hook had a plan to trap Peter Pan once and for all. "With Wendy as bait, we shall lure Peter Pan to his doom," he bragged to Smee. As luck would have it, just as a pirate ship arrived in Neverland, Peter Pan and Tinkerbell appeared. Hook's men fired a cannonball at Peter. Of course, they missed. So Hook pointed to the hanging sack. He boasted that he had captured Wendy and planned to feed her to the octopus that lurked in the water below. "Let her go, you black-hearted scoundrel," commanded Peter as he and Hook began a sword fight. "You want her? Ha! Well, go and get her," Hook shouted. Captain Hook raised his sword and cut the rope holding the sack. To Peter's horror, the sack dropped into the water. Bravely, Peter dived into the water to save his friend. Tinkerbell followed close behind. Peter might need her help. Captain Hook and the pirates peered eagerly over the side of the ship. After a short while, Peter's hat bobbled up to the surface. Minutes later, when Peter didn't appear, Captain Hook shouted triumphantly, "I did it! I did it! I'm free! Free of Peter Pan forever!" But Hook's cheering was cut short. Out of the water rose Peter Pan and Tinkerbell. Peter flew away with the sack in his arms. Tinkerbell sprinkled pixie dust onto the giant octopus, causing it to rise high above the Jolly Roger. Then, Tinkerbell abruptly stopped sprinkling pixie dust. The octopus landed on top of Captain Hook with a loud crash. Hook yowled as the beast started to pull him over the side of the ship. The hungry octopus was very happy to have caught a Captain Hook dinner, but the captain wasn't so happy about being dinner. "Smee!" Hook yelled. Smee grabbed Captain Hook's hand. Smee and the octopus pulled and pulled in opposite directions. Finally, with a mighty yank, Smee wrenched the captain out of the octopus's arms. The 2 pirates flew through the air and fell into the cargo hold. Smee had saved Hook, but the captain wasn't the least bit grateful. "Mr. Smee, be a good fellow and fix the plank, please," Hook growled, "so I can make you walk it." Meanwhile, Peter and Tinkerbell flew to safety. Peter gently placed the sack on the ground and began to untie it. He couldn't wait to see his old friend Wendy. But when Peter opened the sack, pow! Thinking she was still a prisoner of the pirates, Jane had let loose a terrific punch. Ow! You're sure not Wendy, Peter said, rubbing his jaw. Just then, Hook fired a cannonball at them. Peter flew off with Jane in his arms. If you're not Wendy, who are you? Peter asked. I'm her daughter Jane, the girl replied. As they flew over Neverland, Jane was amazed at all the sights below her. Suddenly, Peter stopped flying and dropped Jane into a hollow tree trunk. She slid down a very long chute. Jane landed at the bottom of the underground treehouse where Peter lived with the Lost Boys. Nibs, Slightly the twins, Chubby, Cubby, and Toodles dropped down from the ceiling to greet her. This is Jane, Peter told the boys. She's going to stay here and be our new mother and tell us stories. The Lost Boys gathered around Jane excitedly, but Tinkerbell wasn't so pleased. She wanted Jane to go home. Tinkerbell didn't want to share Peter Pan's attention. Let's play a game, said Nibs. How about treasure hunt, Peter suggested, but Jane didn't want to play. No, 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 Jane shouted. I have to go home, Jane told him and stomped off. What's the matter with her? Asked Cubby. Peter scratched his chin and thought hard. I don't know, he said. She acts kind of like a grown-up. Ew, said the Lost Boys. Excuse me. Peter followed Jane and soon found her building a raft so that she could sail home. He watched as Jane pushed her raft into the water and jumped on board, but she didn't get far. Almost immediately, the raft began to break up and sink. Jane fell into the water with a big splash. When he saw she was in trouble, Peter flew out to save Jane. The only way out of here is to fly, Peter explained. Then he set her down on top of a ledge. Anybody can do it, Peter assured her. All it took was faith, trust, and pixie dust. But Jane refused to believe she could fly, so Tinkerbell sprinkled some pixie dust on the Lost Boys, and they glided in the air around her to show her how it worked. Then Peter asked Tinkerbell to sprinkle Jane with pixie dust too, but Tinkerbell didn't want to do anything to help Jane. She thought that Peter liked Jane too much. Peter knew just how to persuade Tinkerbell. Gosh, if Jane can't fly home, I guess she'll have to move in with us, he whispered to the tiny fairy. Tinkerbell didn't like that idea at all, so she sprinkled Jane with lots and lots of pixie dust, and all the dust made Jane sneeze. Now Peter was sure that Jane could fly, so he nudged her off the ledge, but Jane didn't have the faith and trust she needed to fly. Ah! Jane cried as she fell. The Lost Boys tried to catch her, but they missed, and Jane landed on the soft ground with a thud. Jane was terribly angry and upset. Leave me alone, she cried. I don't believe in any of this, and I especially don't believe in fairies. As Jane stormed away, Tinkerbell began falling toward the ground. She could no longer fly, and her light was fading. Peter knelt down to hear what Tinkerbell was saying. A worried Peter told the Lost Boys, if we don't get Jane to believe in fairies, Tink's light's gonna go out. The group sped off to find Jane. Meanwhile, Jane came upon Captain Hook, who was weeping miserably. He told her that Peter Pan had stolen his treasure, but Hook needed it to sail home to his mother. Captain Hook promised to take Jane home if she helped him find the treasure. Jane agreed and gave her a whistle to signal him when he found the treasure. Jane didn't know it, but she had been tricked into Captain Hook's plan to capture Peter Pan. Soon, Jane met up with Peter and the Lost Boys. Jane, I'm awful sorry, Peter said. We want to do something to make it up to you. We want you to feel like you're one of us. Well, Jane said, why don't we play treasure hunt? That's a great idea, said Peter, but you'll have to think like a lost boy and have fun like a lost boy. Jane couldn't remember the last time she'd had so much fun. Eventually, Jane discovered the treasure, but she remembered Hook's whistle. Jane realized that she didn't want to betray her new friends, so she threw the whistle away. Unfortunately, Toodle saw the shiny whistle, picked it up, and blew it loudly. "No! Wait! No!" Jane cried out, but it was too late. Captain Hook and the pirates heard the whistle and in no time captured Peter and the Lost Boys. Hook thanked Jane. "I couldn't have done it without you," he told her. "You're a traitor, Jane," Peter shouted angrily. "And because you don't believe in fairies, Tink's light is going out." Hook took Peter and the Lost Boys back to his ship. This time he wasn't going to let Peter get away. Jane needed Tinkerbell's help, but she found the tiny fairy very weak. Jane started to cry. "I'm so sorry," she said, because she did believe in fairies. Then something magical happened. Tinkerbell's light started to flicker. Soon the fairy's light was shining brighter than ever before. Jane and Tinkerbell arrived at the Jolly Roger just in the nick of time. They easily outwitted Hook, especially when Tinkerbell sprinkled Jane with pixie dust and Jane flew away before Hook could capture her. Then, just after Jane freed Peter, Hook made another attempt to grab her. "Gotcha!" Hook bellowed as he swung on a rope toward her. But Peter swiftly grabbed his dagger and cut the rope. Hook fell into the water. And onto the octopus. "Smee!" yelled Hook as he tried to escape. "Let's hear it for Jane, the one and only lost girl," the Lost Boys shouted. Peter looked sad. "You can fly now. You can go home," he told Jane. "I'll miss you," Jane admitted. "But now I have great stories to tell, all about Peter Pan and the Lost Boys." So Peter Pan, Tinkerbell, and Jane flew back to Jane's home in London. At home, Jane and her family were very happy to be reunited. Jane told her mother and Danny about her adventures in Neverland, about pirates and treasure, the giant octopus, Tinkerbell, and especially Peter Pan. Peter saw that his old friend Wendy was now a grown-up. "You've changed," he told her. "Not really. Not ever," Wendy answered. Wendy would always believe in Peter Pan, and now Jane would too. The end.